Hey everyone. So if you've ever been young and had dreams of becoming a filmmaker, and especially if you grew up in England, there's a pretty big chance you've heard of Edgar Wright. In fact, you probably went through a whole Edgar Wright phase when you were younger. You know, watching all of his films, falling in love with how he blends fast-paced editing, genre bending, and that classic British humour into a body of work which is instantly recognisable and unmistakably his own. I, for one, definitely went through my own Edgar Wright phase when I was younger. In fact, he was probably one of the very first filmmakers who I knew by name, whose movies I actively sought out and studied. Not just for the story, but for how the story was being told, how the full potential of cinema was being utilised. You know, the visual flair, the clever use of music and sound design, the rapid, intricate editing, the keen sense of rhythm and timing. Watching Edgar Wright's films was really eye-opening for me as a young guy getting into the medium, and I think lots of people have the same experience with Wright's work, simply due to how entertaining and accessible his movies are, but also how they simultaneously provide a really solid and exciting crash course in filmmaking. However, it dawned on me recently that I actually haven't watched any of Edgar Wright's films in years, so what I decided to do was marathon his entire filmography, ranking and reviewing each movie in this week's episode of everyone's favourite series on the channel, Worst to Best. Now, just a reminder, I will only be discussing his canon, feature-length fiction filmography, so no Sparks documentary, no short films, and no Spaced.
If you don't like that, that's too bad.
Anyway, let's get into it. Right, where to begin? In 2003, 1 year before the release of Shaun of the Dead, Edgar Wright directed a music video for Mint Royale's Blue Song, which depicts a getaway driver sat in his car, dancing and singing along to the music, all accompanied with rhythmically synchronized visuals and editing. If you've never seen it before, it's a pretty fun way to spend 3 minutes. However, Wright clearly saw enormous potential with this concept, and 14 years later, wrote and directed Baby Driver, which I feel like exists to ask the question, can the whole marrying sound effects to needle drops to fast-paced editing thing carry an entire feature-length film? And in my opinion, that answer is no. Here's the thing, the first 10 minutes of Baby Driver, they're pretty good. We open with an excellent set piece which perfectly displays Wright's vision for this movie. Fast-paced vehicular action seamlessly intertwined with a carefully curated soundscape. It's exciting, it's funny, and it's all put together incredibly well. Like, I cannot really fault a single cut or shot in this first scene. We then follow this with the opening credits, where Ansel Elgort's baby walks down the street with his earphones in, and once again the environment and the editing all synchronized to the music. It's a solid scene which cleverly recreates that feeling of listening to a song and imagining you're the main character in a music video. However, it is unfortunately my opinion that not only does Baby Driver's central gimmick, if that's what you want to call it, begin to lose much of its unique charm after just these couple of scenes, but also that what remains behind this initial thrill, namely the substance of the movie, is actually pretty bland and unengaging. I can honestly say that I basically do not care about anything or anyone in this film. The romance between Ansel Elgort and Lily James feels artificial and annoying. Most of the side characters are instantly forgettable, and honestly, some of the dialogue in this thing is really cringe-inducing. Perhaps proving that Edgar Wright works far better in the writing department when he has someone like the grounded Simon Pegg to bounce ideas off of. And maybe this is an unfair point to make, I don't know, but I'm always just gonna prefer Edgar Wright when he's working with British actors in a British setting. In fact, if you consider Wright's 3 main directorial trademarks being fast-paced editing, genre bending, and a distinctly British sense of humour, you could argue that none of these elements are really present in this film. Like, sure, there is fast editing in this movie, but it doesn't exactly match that classic, instantly recognisable style you see in films such as Scott Pilgrim vs. the World or the entire Cornetto trilogy. And so, what are we even left with then? Well, in my opinion, a rather tame crime film which isn't particularly exciting or funny or emotional, despite clearly trying to be all of those things. Sure, there are still a few competent action set pieces dotted throughout this thing, my personal favourite being the tequila shootout, mainly due to the fact that Jamie Foxx feels like he's been imported from a far more interesting movie. But overall, Baby Driver is forgettable, and in my opinion, kind of annoying. It's just a personal thing, but I find this film's dialogue and accents and garish colour scheme to be just slightly irritating, especially when compared to Wright's usual charming British grit, if that makes sense. It's all just a bit too shiny and fake and broad for me, and I think it's a shame that Wright's most commercially successful movie is the one which feels least like an Edgar Wright joint. But that's just how things go. Overall, Baby Driver, it's not a terrible film, but it is proof that the whole music video style cannot sustain anything longer than... checks notes. Oh, that's right, a music video. Especially when your plot and characters are as forgettable as this. Also, one of the most anticlimactic endings to a movie I have ever seen. Also, I thought Edgar Wright's taste in music would be a lot better than this. Sorry. So I never actually watched Last Night in Soho until last night in preparation for this video, which I'll admit is a bit weird considering I'm a self-proclaimed Edgar Wright fan and everything, but the truth is, I never really got the urge to watch this. One, because I'm not the biggest horror fan, and two, because I was led to believe by both critics and my friends back in 2021 that this movie was not that good, and... I don't know, I'm not one of those people who is going to watch a film if I hear it sucks, even if it's directed by someone I love. I don't know, man, maybe that's a narrow-minded philosophy to have, but I just don't have the time to watch everything. I mean, I still haven't seen Alien 3 for basically the exact same reasons. Sorry, Alien 3, sorry, David Fincher. I will watch you one day, probably. Maybe. However, it was basically 5 minutes into watching Last Night in Soho. Around the time I realised that the film was about a student who romanticizes the 1960s and who exclusively listens to music from that era and who finds the contemporary culture of English universities to be incredibly alienating and surreal. It was around that moment where I realised that this was going to be a film I like more than most other people. Hell, that's basically the plot for the book I've been writing for the last, 3 years or whatever. What the hell, Edgar? Did you hack into my Google Docs or something? But anyway, overall I would say that, at least for this film's first half, I was really into it. Now, here's the thing. If you're expecting a typical Edgar Wright movie, you are going to be disappointed, because honestly, I wouldn't have even been able to tell you that this was made by him if I had just gone into it blind. Here you will find none of Wright's signature trademarks, none of that idiosyncratic editing or brilliant sense of humour. I mean, don't get me wrong, the editing is still good, and there is this one joke about North and South London which admittedly made me burst out laughing, but don't get it twisted, this is nothing like your standard Edgar Wright joint. But like I've already said, this didn't stop me from really enjoying the movie for the first hour. Yes, because of the personal connection I had to Thomasin McKenzie's character, who is brilliant here, by the way, one of my favourite performances from Wright's entire filmography. But also because, one, it's far more impressive technically than I was led to believe. The production design and lighting and cinematography of this thing are all beautiful, especially the 1960s scenes. There's this one bit where Matt Smith is dancing with both Thomasin McKenzie and Anya Taylor-Joy, and yeah, it's kind of hard to explain if you haven't seen the film, but it's just this excellent example of dynamic, practical filmmaking. And two, the mystery which is set up in the movie's first half is really engaging. Now, is Edgar Wright's portrayal of men being creepy and bad the most nuanced thing I've ever seen? No. Is Edgar Wright's portrayal of bullying the most nuanced thing I've ever seen? No, although... what was her name? Jocasta? Easily one of the most hateable characters I've ever witnessed. I was constantly waiting for her to receive some sort of redemption or empathy, but no, she's just horrible, and I'm kind of glad they kept her that way. But yeah, anyway, I was liking Last Night in Soho, and was really interested to see where the film would take its intriguing premise. Unfortunately, once this movie enters its second hour and it actually has to start delivering on everything which has been set up, it kind of drops the ball. Now, that's not me saying it falls off a cliff, just that it drops the ball, and I think that's a fair criticism. It's basically what everyone says about Last Night in Soho. What is revealed in the film's second half, while still with its moments, is far less creepy than what is hinted at in the film's first half, which is crazy to say because usually Edgar Wright's films are the opposite of lopsided. Usually there is a very clear and consistent narrative with 3 acts which are all densely linked together. However, when it comes to Last Night in Soho, not so much. The other criticism I have, although keep in mind it's what I say about 99% of horror films I watch, is that it's just not that scary. Here's the thing, and I understand this is very subjective, but the only horror films to ever actually get to me are the ones where the film itself feels haunted. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining and Dario Argento's Suspiria being perfect examples of this. Because yes, they have scares, but they go deeper than that. There is something about the very core of those movies which is just inherently unnerving. And Last Night in Soho, despite clearly being inspired by directors like Dario Argento, just doesn't have that at all. Again, I'm not the biggest horror aficionado, but that's the best way I can describe it. The film feels just far too polished and neat for what I think it's trying to be by the end, which is some surreal, grotesque nightmare about nostalgia. But again, Last Night in Soho was a lot better than I expected it to be, despite faltering in its second half, and overall I just feel like it has far more personality and bravery than the ultra-broad Baby Driver, which is why it lands ahead of it in this list. That's just my opinion though, don't cancel me. A Fistful of Fingers was definitely the biggest shock of this whole project for me. Released in one cinema for one screening when Edgar Wright was a 20-year-old student, I immediately assumed this micro-budget western spoof, which I could only find on YouTube, would land rock bottom of this list. However, upon watching A Fistful of Fingers for the first time, I was pleasantly surprised to discover that this is not only a genuinely competent, fun, and rather charming movie, but honestly, maybe the single most impressive low-budget student film I have ever seen. The passion throughout this movie is just infectious. Like, I'm gonna sound crazy, but you can literally tell after about 15 minutes that whoever made this was always going to become an established director. Now, don't get me wrong, A Fistful of Fingers is obviously extremely rough around the edges, and if you struggle watching movies with this lower budget, you're gonna have it dead last in your own personal Edgar Wright ranking. However, I'm the type of guy who actually finds this unpolished guerrilla aesthetic really endearing, especially when the film still manages to be as consistently engaging and entertaining as this one. In fact, this is kind of an insane comparison to make, but in many ways A Fistful of Fingers reminded me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Yes, because of the satire and the fake horses and that hilarious ending, all of which I imagine are direct homages to the British comedy classic. But more than those things, it has that special feeling of basically just being a constant joke factory. Like, if you just saw this film's budget and runtime, I think you'd assume that the jokes would be really drawn out, using up as much time and as little money as possible to eventually hit that feature film length. But no, the jokes in this thing come thick and fast, and honestly, most of them land, which is kind of remarkable. However, despite the movie's parodic, satirical nature, there is still tons of originality and style to be witnessed here. In fact, many of Edgar Wright's trademarks can be traced back to this student film, most predominantly the guy's penchant for inventive visual comedy. Again, the number of gags Wright is able to fit into just 1 hour and 17 minutes is so impressive. And that's the word I keep coming back to when discussing this movie. Impressive. Like, yeah, this thing is a student film. Realistically, it's all over the place, the pacing's pretty bad, and let's just say that some of the stuff in here has not aged well, racially speaking, but overall, I was just in awe of how much Wright was able to do with the budget he had at the age he was. It's honestly very inspiring, so fair play. Okay, this is gonna be a long one because The World's End is one of those films I've always had a complicated relationship with. This is of course the third and final entry in Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy, a connected series of comedic genre films written by Wright and Simon Pegg, and starring Pegg alongside my boy Nick Frost. Just some context, the first two entries into the trilogy, Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, were always films that I really loved and respected, for reasons we'll get into later. And so it was that when it finally came time for me to sit down and watch The World's End, the final entry in this potentially perfect trilogy, I left feeling incredibly disappointed. Now, to be fair, were my expectations sky high? Yes. Was I constantly comparing its quality to that of Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz? Yes. But to be fair to my younger self, Of course I was going to. This might be considered a hot take these days, I don't know, but I think comparison is a very natural and fair tendency to have when discussing and judging art. And I've never really understood people who condemn this, who say, no, you have to critique every piece of art as its own individual thing. It's something I hear a lot, especially from the Legend of Korra defenders. And look, while I do think you should be able to separate a piece of art from its greater lore and legend, I don't necessarily think you always should, because context is important. The relationship a film or a TV show or a, I don't know, kabuki play has to other works are important. They shape our expectations and understanding and are just as valid a part of the conversation as anything else. And I believe this is especially true in cinema. I mean, look at the Kuleshov effect. This whole medium is about the relationship between images, between ideas. So yeah, you get the overall idea. I didn't like The World's End when I first saw it. I thought it was really underwhelming, and to be honest, it took me a good few years to pluck up the courage and watch it again, whereupon my feelings on the film were softened slightly. Now, don't get me wrong, I still found the movie to be pretty dissatisfying, but it wasn't as bad as I remembered, you know? I chuckled a few times, I could finally sort of see what Wright and Pegg were attempting to go for, even if the film still mostly didn't work for me, which all brings us to this most recent rewatch, which I did for the very video you are currently watching. This was the third time I'd seen The World's End, and to be honest, guys, don't tell anyone, but I think I have finally made my peace with this film. Now, don't get me wrong, The World's End is still, in my opinion, far from the underrated masterpiece which many people on the internet claim it to be. This film is still nowhere near the quality of Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, and we will discuss why that is in a second. However, I can now say that I have come to appreciate and respect this film in its own special way. But before going into what I liked about The World's End, I think we first need to talk about the movie's flaws, most of which I noticed during that first viewing and which I still adamantly stand by today. So, first of all, this film is just strangely not that funny. This becomes especially clear when you're doing a marathon of all three movies, but even just compared to your standard British comedy, the laughs are far and few between. And look, I get that this film is trying to be a bit more serious than something like Hot Fuzz or Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which both kind of have that one laugh every 5 seconds feeling. But there are still a ton of jokes in this film, and to be honest, a surprisingly large amount of them do not land, at least not for me. The whole WTF running gag, the really very sad line, and the joke about Jesus writing the Bible immediately spring to mind as moments which I found painfully unfunny even when I was like 14 years old. Also, this might be a hot take, but I just don't find drunkenness amusing at all. Like, I went to a university in England for 3 years, so at this point it is just very boring to watch. And to be fair, I don't think the film itself finds inebriation that funny either, considering all the stuff with Gary King and his struggles with addiction, which is very clearly inspired by Simon Pegg's own journey with alcoholism, depression, and eventual rehabilitation. I mean, come on, 12 pubs, 12 steps, it's all I've got, 5 waters, please. This film's commentary on substance abuse is not exactly subtle, and while I actually find it to be quite powerful, it doesn't exactly lend to humorous rewatches, if that makes sense. Like, once you know what this movie is about, all of those haha drinking moments just feel really jarring and tonally inconsistent and kind of sad. At least that's how I feel. I've heard of people watching this film drunk, which to me is like watching Trainspotting while doing heroin, but you do you, I guess. So yeah, while The World's End still does have its laugh out loud moments...
Mr. Shepherd.
Please, call me Guy.
All right. Guy.
Overall, it is very disappointing in the humour department, especially compared to Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, where basically 100% of the jokes completely land every single time. It's actually quite hard to believe that they were written by the same people, but anyway. My second criticism of The World's End comes down to its characters, who, besides from Gary King, who we'll get to in a second, are incredibly underwritten and thin, in my opinion. Like, you have the character of O-Man, for example, played by Martin Freeman, who, to be fair, I think is supposed to be boring and kind of empty, especially once he is turned into a blank off screen, but basically all of the other characters feel just as underdeveloped. Take Paddy Considine's Stephen Prince, for example. Basically the third main character in the entire film, yet he honestly has less personality and less memorable moments than Considine's Detective Sergeant Andrew Wainwright in Hot Fuzz, despite having far less screen time and plot relevance. And then you have Andrew Knightley, played by Nick Frost, who once again just doesn't have that much going for him as a character. Now, do I respect the role reversal in this film, the decision to have Peg play the screw-up and Frost play the more serious one? Yes, I actually do, and I think that they both have the acting chops to make it work. However, unfortunately for The World's End, none of these characters are likable or interesting, so it doesn't really matter. Like I've already said, the only person in the entire movie who actually somewhat feels like a character is Gary King. And look, Simon Pegg plays him very well, especially in the more dramatic moments in the film's final act. But I guess my problem with Gary King, and this speaks to the heart of why I struggle with The World's End as a whole, is that I have absolutely no idea what I'm supposed to be feeling or thinking about anything or anyone in this film. Now that might sound like a really weird and perhaps immature criticism to make, but let me explain. In Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, we are watching flawed, yet likeable protagonists. There is a sincerity to the humour of those films. There is a heart which is rather wholesome, actually, especially when it comes down to the central Peg-Frost character dynamic. In The World's End, however, everything feels empty and disingenuous. We are basically watching an incredibly annoying and kind of horrible man-child drag his old friends who very clearly do not want to be there on a pub crawl. And I'm not gonna lie, it's miserable. Again, I don't know if this is on purpose, but it's just not fun to watch at all. Even without the knowledge of Gary King's struggles with alcoholism and his suicide attempt, which is revealed in the film's final act, the guy is just irritating, unfunny, sad, and a complete arsehole. Now, not only is it pretty uncomfortable watching someone as likable as Simon Pegg playing someone as nasty as Gary King, but I feel like the film itself never really knows how to feel about him. Like, how am I supposed to react to this man and his 4 dull friends? Am I supposed to be laughing when these people sit down and make small talk? When Gary makes some unfunny remark? When Andy sits there rolling his eyes and looking bored? Is this supposed to be funny? Tragic? Both? To be honest, I have no idea, and it means I spend most of the first half of this film just kind of bored and a bit confused. I can't really explain it, but the vibes throughout this movie, especially in the first half, just feel off. I don't believe any of these characters were ever friends with each other, and hey, maybe that's the point of the whole movie, but I don't know, it doesn't exactly make for an entertaining watch. But again, I don't know if this film is trying to be some fun, genre-bending romp like the first two in the trilogy, or if it's trying to be a deeply miserable character study about addiction and nostalgia. The tone is simply too foggy and vague to figure out, which makes the viewing experience kind of difficult, at least for me. My third main criticism is that it just doesn't feel anywhere near as tight as Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz. Like, those two movies have this incredible feeling of payoff, where basically every line has multiple meanings and or callbacks. It's very satisfying and one of Wright's best trademarks. However, when it comes to The World's End, while it's definitely still there, it's just nowhere near as tight or clever or dense. I also don't find what this film does with the genre to be as exciting as Shaun of the Dead or Hot Fuzz. And again, while I hugely respect Wright and Pegg and Frost for doing something different, you know, moving away from the formula of the first two, it does make for a less coherent trilogy. Like, even the fence gag in this film just isn't that funny, which is a shame and kind of sums up the negative feelings I've always harbored towards this film, but anyway, that's enough of that. Let's talk about the things I've actually come to like and appreciate about The World's End. Firstly, all of Edgar Wright's idiosyncratic editing and transitions are still here, and that's always going to be a huge positive. It just makes the film more fun to watch. Second of all, usually the further along in a trilogy or series of movies you go, the longer and messier they become, especially in regards to structure and flow. But to be fair, The World's End is actually surprisingly well-paced. It clocks in at 108 minutes, and I'll be honest, I'd actually be fine if the film was maybe like 5 to 10 minutes longer, but I do respect the discipline and self-control here. Also, I was shocked to see this thing was made for only like $20 million. I honestly would have guessed the budget was double that, especially considering all of the alien stuff, so fair play. Next up, I've really come to appreciate everything this film is doing in terms of corporate homogenization and how it links into the whole alien invasion plot. It's actually rather clever and profound, and not something I picked up on properly until this most recent rewatch. Also, there are multiple action set pieces in this thing which come out of nowhere and which are brilliantly directed. The moment where Gary is fighting while trying to finish his pint of beer, an homage to Jackie Chan's Drunken Master, being a standout. But of course, where I think The World's End truly shines, even if the execution is again kind of tonally inconsistent, is everything the film does in relation to alcoholism. Especially considering Simon Pegg's own struggles with addiction, it's all pretty damn poignant. poignant. Now, do I think these themes necessarily blend well with Edgar Wright and the Cornetto trilogy's signature style? No, in fact, it's pretty jarring. Do I wish that Wright and Pegg had made this its own separate thing before going on to conclude the Cornetto trilogy with something more akin to Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz? Yeah, I think so. I think that would have been the better decision for both The World's End and the Cornetto trilogy. However, that no longer stops me from simply respecting Wright, Pegg, and Frost for trying something different here. Not all of it lands for me, especially in the first half, but I don't know, man. Once this film actually gets going, it definitely has its moments. What can I say? So these final three movies are what I personally consider to be the zenith of Edgar Wright's directorial career so far. Yet, considering its placement on this list and how many times I must have seen the thing, especially during my teenage years, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is kind of a difficult film to talk about. I think it belongs in the same camp as Pulp Fiction and Star Wars as a movie which has been just so exhaustively discussed and debated and memed upon since its initial release that it can be hard to just sit down and watch the thing sincerely without all of that outside noise. This isn't helped by the fact that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is 1, incredibly of its time, and 2, simultaneously a satire, a deconstruction, and an honest portrayal of said time period, which makes watching this film in 2024 pretty fascinating. But before getting into any of that, let's first quickly discuss the context of this movie. So, in 2004, the same year Shaun of the Dead released, Canadian cartoonist Brian Lee O'Malley published Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, the first in what would become a 6-part graphic novel series chronicling the adventures of a 23-year-old slacker named Scott Pilgrim, who must battle the 7 evil exes of his new girlfriend Ramona Flowers in order to win her heart. I'm sure you know all of this already. The graphic novels, with their blend of video game references, indie rock culture, and awkward coming-of-age drama, quickly garnered a devoted fanbase, and when the conversations of an adaptation rolled around, Edgar Wright was the obvious choice to direct. And when you sit down to actually watch this film, it becomes so apparent so quickly just how perfect this creative decision was. The combination of Brian Lee O'Malley's quirky, character-driven, nerd culture-infused storytelling and Edgar Wright's energetic, hyper-stylized direction is truly one of those perfect cinematic marriages, right up there with Aaron Sorkin and David Fincher, or, I don't know, Hunter S. Thompson and Terry Gilliam, you know? It just fits. Also, on top of all of this, Edgar Wright? Huge nerd, which surely must have only helped during production, especially when it comes to making an adaptation which is both faithful to the source material while simultaneously making the necessary changes to best fit the medium. In fact, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is commonly cited as one of the best and most respectful film adaptations of all time. And there are many fans of Brian Lee O'Malley's graphic novels who actually think that the movie is superior, including the guy talking to you right now. Don't get me wrong, not everyone thinks this, but it's not an unpopular opinion to have, you know? I don't think anyone will get really annoyed at you for thinking the movie is the superior piece of work, which I feel like is very rare for any book fandom, so fair play. Also, speaking of adaptation, I'd argue that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is one of the single best examples of a piece of cinema capturing that feeling of reading a comic book, both in its style and in its pure energy. Here you will find some of the most fun, dynamic, and creative editing and framing and transitions and visual comedy ever put onto film. This thing is just so dense with these small moments of filmmaking which inspire me so much to try new things and think outside the box in my own creative pursuits. The 3 which immediately spring to mind being the moment Scott jumps out of the window, that whole Seinfeld scene, and the I gotta pee on her bit, which Orson Welles wishes he could have directed. In fact, it's kind of crazy considering how many comic book adaptations we've gotten since 2010, that the only movies to even come close to this level are the Spider-Verse films, which, I mean, damn Hollywood, do better. Get Edgar Wright to direct the next Ant-Man movie or something. I'm sure that would go really well. Just a few more praises to heap onto this thing. Here we have easily one of the most perfect ensemble casts that I can think of. The chemistry between basically every actor in this film is insane, and you can really see how much fun everyone had while on set. Similar to The World's End, the spontaneous action set pieces are excellent, wearing their manga and video game influences completely on their sleeve, while of course delivering genuinely great fight choreography. The movie is endlessly quotable, the visual effects haven't aged a day, surprisingly, the sound design, the music, the Legend of Zelda references, they all combine to create an incredibly impressive and fun piece of work. You know, this is one of those movies which is near endlessly rewatchable because every time you do rewatch it, you notice something new, some hidden detail, some small Easter egg in the background. It's great stuff. So why then is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World only number 3 in this list? Why do I consider it to be the worst of the best, if you will? Well, I'd say there's 2 main reasons. First of all, I think this film slightly loses steam around its third quarter. It's usually the scene where Scott and Ramona argue and fight lesbian Katara, where I start to think, okay guys, we've had a lot of fun here, but it's time to, it's time to wrap this thing up. Now, part of me thinks that this slight pacing problem was basically inevitable due to the content of the graphic novel that they were adapting. Think about it. 7 evil exes, 7. It's a very awkward number to try and structure a movie around, isn't it? Yet, another part of me thinks that the movie is just slightly too long. Now, don't get me wrong, 113 minutes, pretty standard runtime for a film like this, and it's not like I can even point at a specific scene, or even half of a scene and say, yep, they should have cut this. Because the film is airtight, like most of Wright's movies are. But I just think that when you have a piece of work as stylized as Scott Pilgrim, with characters who are purposefully kind of annoying and kind of not great people, those 113 minutes can get a bit tiring at times. And this leads on to my second criticism of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. It's not even a criticism per se, it's just... how do I put this? Brian Lee O'Malley's original graphic novels take place in a very specific time period and follow a very specific type of people. And with it comes this very cynical, smug, and geeky attitude and sense of humour which I would argue just has not aged well at all. And I say this as someone who unironically used to be exactly like the characters in this movie. Now, here's the thing. Much of this is built into the subtext, like both the graphic novel and the film are definitely aware of how annoying and selfish the characters can be. Like I said earlier, this whole franchise is simultaneously a satire, a deconstruction, and an honest portrayal of that time period. Like, I always find it kind of funny when people say, all the characters in Scott Pilgrim are garbage people. Like, yes, that's a purposeful decision. It's basically the whole point of the story. But we've now hit that point where the first graphic novel was released 20 years ago, and the line between what this story is trying to satirize and what this story is trying to play straight is really beginning to blur. And this of course carries over to the movie, leading to an experience which can at times feel a little disorientating and exhausting. This is of course not the film's fault, just something you're gonna inevitably run into when making a movie so of its time. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. Again, it's really not a huge deal at all, just a slight issue I have with Scott Pilgrim, which I just don't have at all with the timeless Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, which, speaking of... I think if it wasn't for A Fistful of Fingers existing, then Shaun of the Dead, the first entry into the now iconic Cornetto trilogy, would easily be considered one of the single greatest directorial debuts of all time. Which, to be fair, is a bit like saying if my aunt had balls, then she'd be my uncle, but you know what I'm trying to get at. Shaun of the Dead is everything you could possibly ask for from a young and passionate up-and-coming director making his first studio feature film, let's say. This is such a confident piece of work, which simultaneously tells a compelling, hilarious, and surprisingly emotional story, while of course introducing to the world of cinema an incredibly fresh and hungry new voice. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Spaced, and think it's an excellent show, and I'd love to talk about it more on this channel one day. But I think it's only with Shaun of the Dead where we first witness what I like to call peak Edgar Wright. You know, firing on all cylinders in the medium which suits his style best. Most of the guy's classic trademarks which I've been praising for the last half an hour can be traced back to Shaun of the Dead. Or at least this is where he perfected the style which first popped up in things like Spaced and even earlier A Fistful of Fingers. I am of course talking about the whip pans, the quick quick cuts, the aggressive editing of mundane tasks, the dynamic use of sound effects to complement visual gags, the integration of music with action, the tightness of the screenplay, the genius use of foreshadowing, the plethora of meticulously planned callbacks, the quotable dialogue, the iconic British humour, the perfect balance between genre homage and subversion, the brilliant rhythm and pacing. I could go on and on. Wright is able to inject so much flair and style into just 99 minutes that it can honestly be quite an overwhelming experience to watch this thing, simply due to how dense the movie is, but I mean that completely as a compliment. There is not 1 second of this film which isn't trying to do something interesting, you know, with the camera or the dialogue. There is not an ounce of fat throughout the entire runtime, not one moment which feels wasted. And I think this is why many people call Shaun of the Dead a perfect film, and honestly, it's not really a claim I would argue against. This isn't even mentioning what always creeps up on me whenever I watch Shaun of the Dead, which is just how emotional the thing can be when it wants to. You know that video on sincerity I did a few months ago? Well, I think Edgar Wright has such a great handle on when to make a joke and when not to. And this creates a film which is at times genuinely hilarious, like this is easily one of the funniest movies of the 21st century, but which can also at times be rather moving. The obvious example of this being when Shaun has to shoot his mum. It's a surprisingly powerful moment, not just because the jokes grind to a halt, but because we've actually come to care about Shaun quite a lot. Like everything this film does in terms of the desire to sort your life out and finally grow up. It's a genius thematic structure to pair alongside the zombie apocalypse genre, creating a narrative that's not just about survival, but about the existential challenge of stepping up and taking responsibility. It's honestly quite inspiring, especially how it mirrors Edgar Wright's own journey into adulthood and, you know, becoming a proper filmmaker. It's pretty meta. Also, just speaking of Shaun, this is maybe Simon Pegg's best performance. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's been great in everything I've ever seen him in, but there's just something about his line delivery in Shaun of the Dead which gets me every single time.
Are you alright?
And of course, his chemistry with Nick Frost creates, in my opinion, one of the best acting duos in the history of cinema. Like, come on, that goes without saying. You know, it's funny, because in many ways, the Cornetto trilogy kind of mirrors the original Star Wars trilogy. You have the first one, which was a bit of a leap in the dark, but which ended up being an excellent film that exceeded everyone's expectations. Then you have the third one, which, compared to the first two, is disappointing, but which still has its moments, and which manages to just about stick the landing in the end with an emotionally resonant conclusion. Yet, sandwiched between them, you have the second one, which is simply one of the best films of its era. Let's talk about that middle one. So, Hot Fuzz was the first Edgar Wright film I ever watched. It was with a bunch of friends during an overnight movie and Modern Warfare 3 marathon. I must have been around 12 years old at the time, and what can I say? I instantly loved it. And around that time, Hot Fuzz quickly became the film to watch whenever you hung out with people. Like, maybe if you're around my age and grew up in England, you can relate to this, but any sleepover I went to, any time I was with friends and we wanted to watch something, Hot Fuzz was always everyone's first choice. Yes, because it was probably the funniest film any of us had ever seen. Yes, because it had some of the best violence and action that any of us had ever seen. But it was more than that. Even when me and my friends were just 12 years old, we could tell that Hot Fuzz was special in ways we were probably just a bit too young to fully comprehend. Having obviously zero understanding of filmmaking or editing or screenwriting or even what any of those things really mean. Yet, as I grew older and learnt more about cinema, I would often sit down to revisit Hot Fuzz with a slightly deeper understanding of filmmaking, and each time I would be rewarded with something new to appreciate about the film. It is honestly, along with the original Star Wars and maybe The Big Lebowski, the movie I have watched the most times. Yes, because it's wildly entertaining, but also because it just gets better and better every single time you watch it, a quality which I think only the truly best films have. And make no mistake, I do consider Hot Fuzz to be one of the best films I've ever seen. In fact, I literally watched it twice before making this video, not because I was unsure about what to say or anything, but just because it's such a fun and perfect movie which seemingly never gets old. In fact, all of this talking about Hot Fuzz, I might just have to watch it again tonight. I'm being fully serious. So why is Hot Fuzz so good? Well, if we look at Shaun of the Dead as the initial presentation of Edgar Wright's idiosyncratic style, like a showcase of everything the guy has to offer as a writer and director just splayed out across the page, then I see Hot Fuzz as this formula refined and moulded into perfection. You know, it's like Shaun of the Dead's bolder, more confident brother. Every single thing I mentioned earlier about Shaun of the Dead, everything exciting it's doing in terms of dialogue and editing and visual comedy and so on, it is all perfected here in Hot Fuzz. Because as much as I love Shaun of the Dead, it does very much feel like a studio feature film debut, doesn't it? Maybe it's just the budget, but there's this kind of underdog vibe throughout the entire movie, whereas Hot Fuzz, despite coming out only 3 years later, feels like a film made by someone who's done 20 of these things. This is one of those rare pieces of work which you can just tell came out the exact way the creators wanted it to. Also, despite being 20 minutes longer than Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz is somehow even tighter and denser than its predecessor. Here you will find not one wasted scene or line or edit or single second of footage. Everything intricately connects to each other. It is a puzzle with no missing pieces, and it's kind of remarkable to watch unfold. However, this is all backed up by a truly incredible and slightly underrated concept, in my opinion, which blends the buddy cop genre, the action genre, the comedy genre, the satire genre, the mystery genre, and hell, even the slasher genre, into this seamless narrative which, as I've already said, you just appreciate even more every time you revisit it. In fact, this may be a hot take, but I think even without all of Edgar Wright's flair and style, this would have still been a pretty great movie just due to its central premise and characters. I mean, Nicholas Angel, honestly, one of my favourite film characters of all time. Like, bro, that moment he's getting beaten up by Timothy Dalton, then catches the final punch, oh, it's so good. Plus, his relationship to Nick Frost's Danny Butterman is incredibly wholesome and heartwarming, and easily the best Peg-Frost dynamic we've ever received. Yet, unlike Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz's large roster of side characters are just as memorable as the mains. And that's not just due to all of them being played by basically every English actor you could think of, but because just as much attention is given to them in the writing department as anything else. Take the Andes, for example, played by Rafe Spall and Paddy Considine. Not only are they genuinely hilarious, not only do they have more funny lines than 99% of movies have, but they even get their own little redemption arc, and that's the thing about this film. The perfectionist attention to detail that I'm talking about in terms of the editing or the visual comedy or whatever, it basically extends to everything else in this movie. Like, realistically, there's only one flaw I have with the entirety of Hot Fuzz. It's not a huge deal, but I've always found the moment where Danny pretends to stab Nicholas to be a little clunky. It's never really made clear how much Danny knew about the NWA, and I don't know, it stands out I guess because everything else is so good. But other than that, this is a perfect movie in my opinion. And in terms of genre, Hot Fuzz pulls off the truly inspiring magic trick of being both one of the best action movie parodies ever made, but also just one of the best action movies ever made, and in turn, one of the best films ever made. I'm gonna be real with you guys, I could literally talk about Hot Fuzz forever, as I would never run out of praises to heap onto this thing. I can basically recite the entire screenplay from front to back. It is, in my opinion, the clear choice for Edgar Wright's best film, and that's gonna be it. I'm gonna go rewatch Hot Fuzz now. I suggest you do the same thing as well. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Pack it in, Frank, you silly bastard!